Hello, I'm Anthea Vogl and I'm a legal academic working at the University of Technology, Sydney, and a research association at Broader Criminologies. And today it's my pleasure to have with me Professor Leanne Webber, who is a research professor in the Canberra Law School and also a fellow Broader Criminologies research associate. Today, as part of a series on concepts and ideas in Broader Criminologies, in this short video, Leanne will be explaining and reflecting on a key concept in Broader Criminology, which is the idea of internal borders and internal bordering, which she articulated and developed in her influential 2013 book, Policing Non-Citizens. Welcome, Leanne.
Thank you, Anthea.
We might jump straight in and come to the idea of internal bordering and do that via your book, Policing Non-Citizens. In your book, you would introduce and applied the concept of the internal border or internal borders. Can you explain for us the basis of that concept and how you came to it?
Yeah, I think to do that, I'd have to go right back to 2004, or even before that, really. But 2004 was around about the time, or it was the year that I published an article with Ben Bowling. And it was called, now what was it called? Policing Migration, a Framework for Investigating the Regulation of Global Mobility. And that's when I first started thinking about where border controls were actually taking place. And in that article, I used just a simple term. I can say I because this was part of the jointly authored article that I contributed. I really talked about sites of enforcement, which included, offshore sites. Pre-entry controls is how they were being referred to at that stage in the UK, because I was living in the UK at that point. And I also noticed that a lot of post-entry controls seemed to be intensifying, and they were various forms of surveillance. So it wasn't a highly theorised idea, the idea of sites of enforcement, but it was kind of an empirical observation, and just meant to create a framework, as the title suggested, that could guide people's investigation of border control, because it was really, very much in its infancy at that point in time. And since then, of course, a lot of, very clever people have theorised and developed all sorts of ideas about the non-geographic border terminology at that point in time, but people have talked about border externalization and other aspects of the way modern borders are changing since then. But the framework itself has kind of really proven to be a really good foundation for my own empirical work. I've really relied on that. And when I came back to live in Australia and started an academic career, because prior to that I'd been living in Cambridge for quite a while, I did do a little bit of writing on the external border, if you like, in terms of punitive preemption. That was one of the concepts that I looked into a bit. But when it came time to really start some solid, funded empirical research, I decided to focus on the internal border, because really there wasn't that much being done in Australia at the time, understandably, and for very good reason. People were very focused on offshore detention and all the, terrible measures that were being directed towards asylum seekers to deter their arrival. And I figured that enough fine minds were working on that. So really it's from that point onwards that I directed my empirical work towards the internal border.
Great. And you've already mentioned some of the kind of the other theoretical ideas that internal bordering has been in conversation with or indeed given rise to. But when you were thinking about internal bordering and developing the idea in your own work, what were some of the conceptions of borders and policing and membership that it was in conversation with, or that led you to develop the idea?
Yeah, I guess if I go right back again to that 2004 article, there were a couple of things I was trying to do there. With Ben. The first one, I guess, was to identify border control, especially internal border control. No, I shouldn't say that, any border control, as a form of policing, as border policing. And really that terminology, as far as I knew, hadn't been used that much at that point in time. People talked about border control, but I very explicitly used the term policing. And we published that article as well in Policing and Society, which was the key policing journal in order to bring the study of border control into criminology. You know, I'd really had some early experiences at that point in time that showed me some people didn't believe border control was something that criminologists should be studying. But I think framing it in terms of policing and border policing really made links to the policing literature. And that's, of course, where Ben Bowling's background was. So he brought that policing perspective into the work. So that was one conversation, I suppose, we were trying to have at that point in time. And the second contribution, I'm not sure I was conversing with anyone at this point, it was just really trying to create something new, was to think about borders as in relation to border control functions that actually could take place anywhere. So that was, for me anyway, I'm sure other people had thought of it, but for me, that was the first time I'd really encountered the idea of non-geographic borders that could actually, you know, function anywhere. And I guess those two angles, the border control as policing and borders that can happen anywhere, wherever border control functions are performed, I guess I carried those through to that book you mentioned, Policing Non-Citizens, to that work that was behind that book. And I guess at that point, my conception of the type of policing I was looking at in that book was multi-agency networks. And so there was a lot of work being done at the time in policing scholarship on policing networks, nodal governance, security networks, various different terminology for it. So that was the conversation there that was going on there. And that was to do with who actually does that, performs that migration policing role. And in terms of where that role is performed, I guess that book, Policing Non-Citizens, established fairly clearly that that border policing, the internal border, could really be encountered wherever non-citizens were seeking services or happened to encounter either a law enforcement organisation or a service providing organisation that had been incorporated into those networks. So they were the two themes that sort of have continued through, really, the fact that borders can be encountered anywhere within society for non-citizens and the link to policing scholarship.
Thanks. And I mean, it just, even as you re-articulate it, it has such immense explanatory power to think of the border as operating where bordering functions are being exercised, and shifts us away. Yeah, I mean, it really, you know, has the effect of shifting attention to the lives and experiences of non-citizens and their encounters with the state, rather than kind of a fixed idea of the border and where we think it is, and as a geographic kind of concept. Your discussion a little bit about the ways in which notions of policing were shifting and how that influenced your work is a nice lead-in to the next question, which is, I guess, thinking about how policing non-citizens really came out of a really immense empirical study of the networks, agencies and actors that were involved in immigration policing in Australia and in New South Wales in particular, in your book. In your work since that time, so that work was in 2013, and as I wrote this question, I realised that was 10 years ago, which is, yeah, a big reflection. But I was wondering how the idea has evolved and developed, both kind of in your reflections and in your own works, and what your reflections are on that.
Yeah, you're inviting me to talk about the network side of it, and I'll get to that. But before that, I might just talk about, you know, how my actual take on the internal border developed from that particular book, from Policing Non-Citizens, because in that book, I just very briefly introduced, but didn't really develop, the idea of a structurally embedded border. So in the book, I talked about the border being ubiquitous. I started to understand how non-citizens were encountering the border in all sorts of everyday things that most of us take for granted, you know, applying for a driver's license, you know, filling in a tax return, things like that. The idea of a ubiquitous border or a structurally embedded border I introduced in the Policing Non-Citizens book, but it was probably a bit buried in there. And I think that idea, I just want to actually pay a bit of service to the work of Nicholas Rose, who I probably haven't lauded enough in my work. But I'd read something, I think what might have given me the idea of thinking about the border in terms of it being structurally embedded actually dates back to an article in the BJC, the British Journal of Criminology, by Nicholas Rose back in 2000. And he was really interested in how in the developments in technology and governance. And I think the term that he used was switch points, that citizens were increasingly encountering a series of switch points in their engagement with society and with the state in particular. And they had to negotiate these switch points, which were increasingly technologically, mediated, in order to gain the access and benefits of citizenship. And it seemed to me that that idea applied beautifully to non-citizens. If you flip it to non-citizens, in fact, those encounters and those switch points could themselves become sites of enforcement. They could be points at which they were either denied access to benefits because they weren't entitled to the full range of what citizens are entitled to. They could also equally become quite risky encounters, at which point border enforcement might arise, and they could even face exclusion if they're identified as unlawfully in the country. So I guess that was the way that the idea of structurally embedded borders started to take shape. And then I applied it again a little bit more fully and articulated it a bit more after the book in an article in Theoretical Criminology, where I was applying it to some different data from a different project, where I was looking at the SRSS system. Wow, it's been a while since that system, Anthea. It's Status Resolution Support System is what it stands for, isn't it? Yeah, that's the system that supposedly supports asylum seekers while they're living in the Australian community, trying to apply for asylum, and that's being processed. And when I looked at that system, I could see that it really was operating as a part of the structurally embedded border that it served, and the two modalities that I was able to describe looking at that, the data I got from that project, whether it worked via a process of attrition, that people being denied sufficient support, which is really how the system works, could actually act as a form of border control by so demoralising people that they would abandon their claim and leave. But it also operated as a form of surveillance, because the support that came from the government was accompanied by a whole lot of monitoring and surveillance by the agencies that administered it, and it could, if individuals breach some aspect of their visa conditions, that could be reported through this system. So I think this subsequent work really helped me flesh out what the structurally embedded border might be and how it might operate in different contexts. And one other aspect, I think what you were inviting me more to talk about, was the networked policing aspect of the Policing Non-Citizens book. I think, interestingly enough, the current research that I'm doing with some wonderful partners, with Alison Gerard, Marina Lamamo, and Faith Gordon, and Mary Bosworth as a partner investigator actually in that study, we're looking not so much at the policing of people who are in the country under visa conditions, but we're looking at the process of visa cancellation and subsequent deportation because of character concerns, often because someone's maybe committed a criminal offence. So we're looking at that system in a very similar way to how I looked at the migration policing networks in the previous book. We're talking about policing non-citizens. Yep. We're looking at what agencies are involved in that, who gets involved in actually identifying that someone's might be eligible to have their visa cancelled, that kind of thing. But we're framing that in terms of a crimigration assemblage. So that's a little bit of a development on the terminology I used before of migration policing networks. I don't know whether that's going to turn out to just be another fancy name that doesn't add anything, but we're just looking at that and engaging with crimigration for a start. It's amazing that until now I haven't engaged with the crimigration theory in my work. I've been the sort of person that doesn't like to jump on a bandwagon, so I think it's wonderful work, but I think quite often it's been misapplied. So I've waited until now to to do any work that I want to label crimigration. And I'll just have to wait and see whether, once we've got further into that work, whether the idea of an assemblage actually takes us any further than the idea of a network. It might just be a bit of fancy terminology that doesn't help us much at all.
Yeah, that's such great reflections, and kind of shows the development of the idea, both kind of before it came to its fruition and into the present. I mean, yeah, it makes me think about, I think in your book and in work that you've done and in other work about on the internal border, something about the idea of an assemblage helps, I guess, expose that things aren't as organised as they might appear on first blush, and that the people that end up kind of policing and enforcing the border might not be so much part of the plan for border enforcement and exclusion, and yet they become so kind of important and significant in those bordering networks. But yeah, we look forward to reading the next version of the internal border and the structurally embedded border.
That's a great reflection, actually, about how you can use assemblage. I'm going to remember that and perhaps steal it when it comes to analysing. But the other way that I think assemblage might start to expand our thinking beyond networks is it invites a whole range of players, including technological agents. So I think we can possibly include in the idea of a crimigration assemblage how technologies and automated governance are starting to get involved in this process. And I think, especially with this particular system we're looking at, the visa cancellation and deportation, there is quite a bit of automated governance going on in there. And that's something that I haven't explored in previous work.
Great. The final question is about some of the field work that you've done to date, and I guess comes from the ways in which your work, like a lot of border criminological work, is really developed from a study of the border in practice and the border, kind of the way the border operates on the ground. And I was wondering if there's been a particular fieldwork encounter or even a single experience that's had an impact on you, or even something that's been simply memorable as you've undertaken both, I guess, broadly your work, but also your field work in this area.
Yeah, I guess you're right in how you characterised how most of my work has been. It's been about the border in practice. So it's been about official practice a lot of the time, not always, but most of the empirical work has. And I guess if I think about work I've done in the last few years as part of a future fellowship program of research, one thing I did a little bit differently because I wanted to explore very different ways that borders could be formed and look at the interface between bordering and social borders as well. It's a bit hard to explain in a short period of time. But anyway, very novel forms of bordering. And I think, and what I included in that research was some work that included speaking with people who had actually encountered the borders and so the human impacts. And I think that's something that has made a big impact on me, getting involved in that messy and often very distressing aspect of the human implications of a lot of these practices. So just to give a couple of examples, one of the sort of sub-projects I did as part of this research program was about how policing practice might actually form and reinforce borders of belonging. So these are not borders that determine someone's illegally present and tries to expel them, but it's a different type of bordering. And for that project, I spoke with young people from Pacific Island backgrounds and South Sudanese backgrounds, both of whom, are quite marginalised in Australian society at the moment. And it was really quite dramatic and overwhelming to hear how profoundly their experiences of discriminatory policing and even often aggressive policing affected their feelings of belonging. It was quite heartrending, actually. So many, it'd be nice to quote something, I suppose, but there are just so many, it's too hard to pick them out. I mean, one young man talked about, had some wonderful ideas about how policing could be improved, and how he said something like, if, police should understand the trauma of our lives, and then they would approach us differently. Mm-hmm. Another young person said, this was not just about the policing practice, but also the media representation of their their social group, their ethnic group, said, no one thinks you're innocent. No one believes you're innocent. So this is a type of bordering which singles out certain groups for a different type of experience in society, and really had a profound effect on feelings of belonging. And I guess the second example that had quite an impact on me was the work I already mentioned about the SRSS system that is used to support asylum seekers. And I didn't speak directly with asylum seekers in that work. There has been some terrific work done by other people. Lucy Mayblin in the UK, for example, speaking with asylum seekers about the conditions that they face, when they're part of these systems. But I didn't do that. I spoke to some immigration lawyers, and they're such wonderful, dedicated people. I've always had a bit of a soft spot for immigration lawyers. And they described to me, some of the experiences of their clients, and they really talked about the SRSS system as basically designed to just barely keep people alive, just to be the bare minimum of financial support that people needed to stay alive. But beyond that, really not showing any care or consideration. And that was very hard to listen to, but also very evocative and important to hear. And I ended up turning that aspect of the work into a chapter in a book where I framed this aspect of welfare policing, using the welfare system to control and police people as a form of necropolitics. So for those who know a little bit of Foucault, the biopolitics of actually biopolitics of death, literally, but the idea of keeping people in a prolonged state of misery or injury in order to control them. So that's sort of ending on a bit of a down note, but yeah, it was quite a different experience for me, having focused so much on institutional practice, to have these much more human encounters.
Yeah, and such valuable, even though heavy, but really valuable reflections on the ways in which those encounters with people who are part of both resisting but also affected by the border inform your understanding of how the border is operating and its actual impacts, rather than the border as an abstract or even just purely legal or regulatory force in people's lives, which your examples show that it absolutely isn't.
Yeah, absolutely. I have to say, you could start me off on a whole separate video about the importance of not ever viewing anything as being purely a legal system.
Yes.
There's always that human element to it.
Yeah.
So important.
As the legal academic on the call, I couldn't agree more.
Yes, yeah. You're not the legal academic. You're much broader.
Thanks so much, Leanne. It's incredibly generous of you to offer your time and your reflections on the idea of internal bordering and your work on that till now, and indeed what's coming in the future. I really appreciate it, and thanks for the chat.
Yeah, thanks for asking me.
Thanks, Leanne.
Bye.